Good morning, Haslingden. For those who don't know me, my name is Miss Eddie Bean, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about something that is really, really important. Probably nothing is more important than life itself. All lives matter, don't they? My life matters, your life matters, your family's lives matter, your friends' lives matter. It almost doesn't need saying. It's so obvious. I'm white, and white lives matter. Of course they do. No argument there. It doesn't need saying. Because the fact that white lives matter is so ingrained in our psyche, is so ingrained in our society, that we don't need to demand that white lives matter. It's a given. They do. This saying, however, Black Lives Matter, is a little different. This isn't a given. This does need to be said. Now, you might have seen this slogan over the last few months. It's been all over the news. It's been on social media. There's been a lot of argument, a lot of controversy, a lot of debate, lots of it heated, and a lot of vitriol, a lot of unpleasantness said about Black Lives Matter. You might have seen things like this. Black Lives Matter, the slogan, being defaced. So the word black crossed out and white put in its place. And I think that is down to a basic misunderstanding of what this is really about. You might think that's okay to cross out the black and put all lives matter or white lives matter, because you might think, well, it's not right to just single out one group, black lives. Black lives matter seems to suggest white lives don't. That's a basic misunderstanding of what Black Lives Matter is really about. So I'm hoping in the next 10 minutes or so, I am going to clarify what this really means. The Black Lives Matter protest, the organisation, came to the fore about 6 months ago in the world's media. And that was because an event that happened in America. A death of a man called George Floyd. And I'm sure lots of you have heard about George Floyd's death. Again, it's been all over the news. George Floyd was murdered. There is no other word for it. He was murdered in May of this year. He was arrested on an alleged charge of passing a fake $20 bill. He was handcuffed. He had his hands bound behind his back and he was laying face down on the floor in the street. So George Floyd was detained. He wasn't going anywhere. And yet the police officer who arrested George Floyd saw fit to press his knee into George Floyd's neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds. 7 minutes and 46 seconds during which George Floyd could be heard to cry out at least 20 times, "I can't breathe." Where George Floyd was seen to cry out for his mum. And George Floyd's last words were, "Tell my kids I love them. I'm dead." Because 7 minutes and 46 seconds of pressure applied by somebody's knee on George Floyd's neck was enough to kill him. So George Floyd died there in the street. Now, of course, George Floyd was a black man, and the man who killed him was a white police officer. And George Floyd's death was not the first time a black man had been killed by a white police officer, and it wasn't the last either. And that night of George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter protests erupted. And of course, what came out very, very soon was the knowledge that George Floyd's death had been recorded on a mobile phone. As is often the case these days, there's always somebody there to record what's going on. And thank God there was. Because if there hadn't been, we might not have known the truth about George Floyd's death. Because on the night of his death, the police department in question issued a statement saying a man has died in police custody and 4 police officers who were present have been dismissed. And that was it. Until the protest started and until the mobile phone footage became widely seen. Because it then became very clear that what had happened was a murder, not just a death in police custody, not an accidental killing, but a murder. But it took 4 days for the police officer who killed George Floyd to be charged. And who knows, if that footage hadn't emerged, maybe he never would have been. And that is the nub of the Black Lives Matter protest. The protests are not just about a black man being killed by a white police officer whose job it is to protect and serve. The protests are not just about that. The protests are about the fact that black lives seemingly are dispensable. That George Floyd's death didn't matter enough for a murder charge to be brought immediately. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement didn't start with George Floyd. Some people may think it did, but it actually started some years previously with another death, another murder, another killing. And this was the killing of a young man called Trayvon Martin. And this is Trayvon. Trayvon was a 17-year-old boy, I think. To me, this is a boy. And Trayvon Martin lived in Florida, and he'd been visiting his dad, and he'd gone out to the local shop to get a bag of Skittles and a bottle of pop. And he was on his way home to his dad's house, on the phone to his girlfriend, when something happened that ended with his death. Now, Trayvon Martin was killed by a man called George Zimmerman, and George Zimmerman had been patrolling the area in his car that evening, and he was armed with a gun. And he had seen Trayvon Martin, and George Zimmerman phoned the police and said, "There's a suspicious man in my area." And the 911 calls that George Zimmerman made, and a variety of other people made, are all available to listen to. And George Zimmerman can be heard saying, "These people always get away with it." And he's told by the officer not to get out of his car. He's told that a police officer is on their way and to let them deal with it. But George Zimmerman does get out of his car, and he starts to follow Trayvon. And the officer on the line says, "Are you following him?" And he says, "Yeah." And the officer says, "We don't need you to do that, sir." So George Zimmerman is told not to get out of his car and not to follow this young man, but he does. And Trayvon Martin can be heard telling his girlfriend on the phone, "Somebody's following me," and then the phone goes dead. So something happens, a scuffle, an altercation happens between these two men. And it ends with Trayvon Martin being shot dead in the street, a 17-year-old unarmed man. And that's when the Black Lives Matter protest began, because the man who shot Trayvon wasn't arrested because he said it was self-defense, despite the fact that the 911 calls were available to listen to. He said it was self-defense, and the police told Trayvon's family they had no reason to doubt what he said. So the protest started, because again, what seemed to be the case was this young man's life didn't seem to matter, didn't seem to be worthy of an investigation. And it took 4 weeks for George Zimmerman to be charged and ultimately put on trial for the killing of Trayvon Martin. However, he was acquitted. He was acquitted on the basis of self-defence under the Florida laws that stood at the time, that have now been repealed, removed. So the Black Lives Matter movement isn't just about black people being killed. It's about black people being killed with seemingly no consequence, seemingly no justice, their lives not mattering as much as white lives. Now, murders happen all the time, and they are always tragic, they are horrific, and they send ripples through whole communities. Thankfully, they don't happen as much in the UK as they do in the United States. And just last week, a white police officer was shot dead in a police station. Horrific murder. But I've seen on social media, and I've heard people say, where are the protests for him? Where are the protests for that murder? Why is nobody going down on one knee for him? That's a basic misunderstanding again. The person who shot that police officer was charged and will be tried and will be convicted and will receive a life sentence. I'm absolutely sure of that. Whereas the person who shot Trayvon Martin initially wasn't charged. So there is no need to protest for justice for murders where justice is swiftly given. But there is a need to protest for murders where lives seem to be unimportant. And the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement about equal rights. It's a movement that continues from Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, something you've all learned about in history. And you've all been shocked when you've seen the treatment of black people in 1950s and 60s America. You've been shocked when you've seen pictures of lynching in history. But we're not in 1950s and 60s anymore. We're in 2020. And still, this needs saying. Because still, black lives don't seem to matter as much as white lives. And the Black Lives Matter movement is not just a continuation of Martin Luther King, but it's a continuation of the Black Power movement, of the suffragettes, of Stonewall, and of every other organisation that has stood up to say these people are just as worthy as everybody else. These people should be treated equally. Because, yeah, all lives matter. But these are the ones that at the moment don't seem to matter. If you went to an environmental protest and you saw somebody with a sign saying save the rainforest, would you go to them and say, excuse me, save all forests actually? All forests matter. No, you wouldn't. Because it's the rainforests currently that are under threat. If you saw firefighters putting out a house that was on fire, would you go over and say, what about all these houses? Don't they matter? No, of course you wouldn't. Because they're not the ones under threat. So that is why crossing out black in Black Lives Matter and replacing it with all demonstrates a basic misunderstanding as to what this campaign is about. You can do your own research on George Floyd and on Trayvon Martin and on the Black Lives Matter protest and on all of these names. People whose lives seemingly didn't matter. Lives that have been lost with no consequence, no justice, until there's a protest. And that's what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. Treat people well. Treat people equally. This phrase does not say Black Lives Matter more, and it doesn't say only Black Lives Matter, and it doesn't say Black Lives Matter and white lives don't. What this is really about is saying Black Lives Matter as well. Black Lives Matter equally with all other lives. Treat people well, Haslingden, all